Hello and welcome to the Sleepy History Channel After Dark. Tonight we're drifting off into the history of the Democratic and Republican parties in America, how they formed, what they stood for, how their beliefs changed, and how they came to be as we know them today. Let's dive in. Picture, if you will, the year 1789. The ink on the Constitution is barely dry, and George Washington has just taken the oath of office as America's first president. In this moment, something remarkable exists. A nation without political parties. Washington himself warned against them, calling them a potent engine that could tear the young republic apart. And yet, within just a few short years, two distinct political movements would emerge. Movements that would set the stage for everything that followed. Our story begins not with the Democratic and Republican parties you know today, but with their ancestors, the Federalists and the Democratic-Republicans. And at the heart of this division stood two brilliant minds who couldn't have been more different: Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton, Washington's trusted Treasury Secretary, had a vision for America that looked boldly toward the future. He imagined a nation of industry and commerce, of bustling cities and powerful banks. He believed in a strong central government that could actively shape the economy, promote manufacturing, and establish the United States as a force on the world stage. In 1791, Hamilton achieved one of his greatest triumphs: the creation of the first bank of the United States, a central banking system that would manage the nation's finances and debts. To Hamilton, this wasn't just practical, it was essential for America's survival. But across the cabinet table sat Thomas Jefferson, and he saw a very different America. Jefferson's vision was pastoral, agrarian, a nation of independent farmers working their own land, beholden to no one. He looked at Hamilton's bank and saw danger. He feared that concentrating power in a federal government would lead to tyranny, the very thing they just fought a revolution to escape. Jefferson believed in states' rights, in keeping power close to the people, in the wisdom of ordinary citizens rather than wealthy elites. These weren't just policy disagreements. They were competing visions for the soul of America. By 1792, these philosophical differences had crystallized into actual political factions. Hamilton's supporters called themselves Federalists. They drew their strength from merchants in northern cities, from bankers and manufacturers who thrived on Hamilton's economic policies. Jefferson's coalition took the name Democratic-Republicans, a mouthful that captured their dual commitment to democracy and to the Republican principles of the Revolution. Their base was in the South and in rural areas, among farmers and those who distrusted concentrated power. The election of 1796 brought these tensions into sharp relief. It was America's first truly contested presidential election. John Adams, a Federalist, won the presidency. But here's something that seems almost unthinkable today. His vice president was Thomas Jefferson, a Democratic-Republican. You see, under the original Constitution, whoever came in second became vice president. Imagine that today, the president and vice president from opposing parties, forced to work together. It was awkward then too, and it wouldn't last long. Everything changed in 1800. Jefferson challenged Adams for the presidency, and what followed became known as the Revolution of 1800. Not because blood was shed, but because for the first time in American history, power transferred peacefully from one political party to another. The Federalists had controlled the presidency since Washington. Now, the Democratic-Republicans took the helm. This peaceful transition of power was itself a revolutionary act, proving that democracy could work, that elections could change governments without violence or chaos. Jefferson's victory marked a turning point. The Federalists, who had seemed so powerful, began a slow decline. They had bet on urban commerce and strong central authority, but America in the early 1800s was still overwhelmingly rural. After their crushing loss in 1800, and especially after their opposition to the Popular War of 1812, which many Americans saw as a second war of independence from Britain, the Federalist Party essentially collapsed. By 1820, they had vanished from the national stage entirely. For a brief moment, America became a one-party nation. James Monroe's presidency, from 1817 to 1825, was called the era of good feelings because political conflict seemed to evaporate. But this calm was deceptive. Beneath the surface, the Democratic-Republican Party was fracturing, splitting along regional and ideological lines. The question wasn't whether new parties would form, it was what they would become. The pieces are in motion for the next great transformation. The old order is dying. New leaders are rising. And from the ashes of the Democratic-Republican Party, two new movements are about to be born. Movements that will eventually become the Democrats and Republicans we know today. But that transformation didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen peacefully. The story of how we got from Jefferson's Democratic-Republicans to today's two-party system is a tale of bitter rivalries, of slavery's terrible shadow, of civil war and Reconstruction, and of ideas about democracy, freedom, and power that shifted like sand beneath the nation's feet. The year is 1824, and America is about to witness one of the most controversial elections in its history. An election so disputed that it would shatter the era of good feelings and give birth to the modern Democratic Party. Four men sought the presidency that year, all calling themselves Democratic-Republicans. There was Andrew Jackson, the war hero who had crushed the British at New Orleans. There was John Quincy Adams, son of the second president, a brilliant diplomat and intellectual. And there were two others, Henry Clay, the charismatic Speaker of the House, and William Crawford, a traditional Southern politician. But this election would come down to Jackson and Adams, and what happened next would fuel political rage for years to come. The year is 1824, and America is about to witness one of the most controversial elections in its history, an election so disputed that it would shatter the era of good feelings and give birth to the modern Democratic Party. Four men sought the presidency that year, all calling themselves Democratic-Republicans. There was Andrew Jackson, the war hero who had crushed the British at New Orleans. There was John Quincy Adams, son of the second president, a brilliant diplomat and intellectual. And there were two others, Henry Clay, the charismatic Speaker of the House, and William Crawford, a traditional Southern politician. But this election would come down to Jackson and Adams, and what happened next would fuel political rage for years to come. When the votes were counted, something extraordinary had occurred. Andrew Jackson had won the most popular votes. He had won the most electoral votes. By every measure that seemed to matter, the people had chosen Jackson, but he hadn't won a majority of electoral votes, and under the Constitution, that meant the election would be decided by the House of Representatives. What unfolded was what Jackson's supporters called the corrupt bargain. Henry Clay, who had come in fourth and was now out of the running, wielded enormous influence in the House. Clay and Jackson despised each other. They were oil and water, their visions for America completely incompatible. So Clay threw his support to Adams. The House elected Adams president, and then Adams made Clay his Secretary of State. To Jackson and his followers, this was theft, pure and simple. The will of the people had been overturned by backroom dealing between elites. For the next 4 years, Jackson seethed, and he built something new. Jackson and his political manager, Martin Van Buren, a cunning New York politician who understood party organization better than anyone of his era, began constructing the first truly modern political party. They created networks of newspapers to spread their message. They organized rallies and local committees in towns across America. They built a machine designed to mobilize voters, and they gave it a name: the Democratic Party. The word Republican was quietly dropped. This was to be the party of the common man, standing against what Jackson called the aristocracy of wealth and privilege. The election of 1828 was vicious, perhaps the nastiest in American history up to that point. Adams's supporters called Jackson a murderer, pointing to duels he'd fought and men he'd executed during his military career. They called his wife Rachel a bigamist because of technical irregularities in her divorce from her first husband. Jackson's supporters called Adams a corrupt elitist who had stolen the previous election. When Jackson won in a landslide, he believed he'd finally achieved justice. But Rachel died just weeks after the election, and Jackson blamed the stress of the campaign attacks. He would never forgive the political establishment. Jackson's presidency transformed American politics in ways we still feel today. His inauguration in March 1829 saw thousands of ordinary citizens flood into Washington, so many that they mobbed the White House reception, standing on furniture in muddy boots, breaking china, forcing Jackson himself to escape through a window. To his supporters, this was democracy in action. The people's house belonged to the people. To his critics, it was mob rule. Jackson championed what he called Jacksonian democracy, the idea that government should be responsive to the common white man, not just the wealthy elite. He expanded voting rights, at least for white men. During his era, most states eliminated property requirements for voting, dramatically expanding the electorate. Jackson portrayed himself as the champion of the frontier farmer and the urban worker against the moneyed aristocracy of the East. But Jackson's legacy was complex and troubling. In 1830, he signed the Indian Removal Act, which forced Native American tribes from their ancestral lands in the Southeast to territories west of the Mississippi River. The Cherokee Nation tried to fight this in the courts and actually won their case in the Supreme Court. But Jackson reportedly said, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." The result was the Trail of Tears, a forced march in which thousands of Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, and other native peoples died. It remains one of the darkest chapters in American history, and it was championed by the founder of the modern Democratic Party. Jackson's other great battle was against the Second Bank of the United States. Like Hamilton's bank before it, the Second Bank was a central institution managing the nation's money supply. But Jackson saw it as a corrupt monopoly that benefited wealthy Eastern bankers at the expense of ordinary farmers and workers. In 1832, he vetoed the bill to wreck Heart of the Bank, and when he won re-election that year, he took it as a mandate. He withdrew federal deposits from the bank and distributed them to state banks, what his opponents mockingly called pet banks. This battle over banking was more than economic policy. It was about who would control the American economy and whose interests the government would serve. Jackson's opponents didn't sit idle. They coalesced into a new party, the Whig Party, named after the English Whigs who had opposed royal tyranny. The American Whigs saw Jackson as King Andrew I, a tyrant who abused presidential power. Led by Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, the Whigs favored a strong Congress, internal improvements like roads and canals funded by the federal government, and yes, a national bank. They drew support from merchants, manufacturers, and many in the emerging middle class who saw economic development and modernization as America's path forward. By the mid-1830s, the two-party system had been reborn. Democrats versus Whigs. These weren't the Federalists and Democratic-Republicans of the founding era. These were new coalitions built for a new age. The Democrats positioned themselves as the party of the common man, skeptical of big government and big banks, supporting states' rights and westward expansion. The Whigs saw themselves as the party of progress and moral improvement, supporting economic development and a more active federal government. But there was a shadow hanging over all of this, a question that neither party wanted to confront directly: slavery. In the 1830s and 40s, both Democrats and Whigs tried desperately to avoid the issue, knowing it could tear their coalitions apart. The Democrats were strong in the South, where slavery was the foundation of the economy, but they also had support among Northern workers who feared competing with freed black labor. The Whigs had anti-slavery voices in their Northern wing, but they also had Southern members who owned slaves. For now, both parties maintained an uneasy silence. They made compromises. They avoided direct confrontation. They tried to focus on other issues: banking, tariffs, westward expansion. But slavery wasn't going away. With each new territory added to the United States, the question became more urgent. Would it be slave or free? And that question, more than any other, would eventually destroy the Whig Party and transform the Democrats into something very different from what Jackson had built. As the 1840s gave way to the 1850s, the ground was shifting beneath American politics. New movements were emerging: abolitionists demanding an end to slavery, free soilers insisting that Western territories remained free of slave labor, nativists fearful of Catholic immigration from Ireland and Germany. The old party system was straining under pressures it couldn't contain much longer. A storm was gathering, and when it finally broke, it would sweep away the Whigs entirely and give birth to a new party, a party that would take the name Republican and change the course of American history forever. The 1850s began with hope for compromise, but they would end with the nation hurtling toward its greatest crisis. And at the center of it all was a question that could no longer be avoided: what would become of slavery in America's vast western territories? In 1850, Congress passed what seemed like a grand solution: the Compromise of 1850. California would enter the Union as a free state, which pleased the North. But in exchange, the South got something too: a new, more aggressive Fugitive Slave Act that required Northerners to assist in capturing and returning escaped slaves, even in free states. Federal commissioners could compel ordinary citizens to join posses hunting down runaways. Anyone who helped a fleeing slave could be fined or imprisoned. For many Northerners, this was a bridge too far. It was one thing to tolerate slavery where it existed. It was another to be forced to participate in it. Suddenly, slavery wasn't just a Southern problem. It was in Northern courtrooms, on Northern streets, tearing at Northern consciences. The Fugitive Slave Act radicalized thousands of previously moderate Northerners and gave the abolitionist movement a power it had never had before. But the wound was about to be ripped open even wider. In 1854, Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, a Democrat with presidential ambitions, introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Douglas wanted to organize the vast territories of Kansas and Nebraska for settlement and eventual statehood, and he needed Southern support to do it. So he proposed something radical: let the settlers in each territory vote on whether to allow slavery. He called it popular sovereignty. Let the people decide. It sounded democratic, but there was a problem. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had already banned slavery in these territories. Douglas's bill would overturn that 34-year-old agreement. The Kansas-Nebraska Act passed, and the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Both pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers rushed into Kansas, determined to win the vote. Violence erupted. Pro-slavery border ruffians from Missouri crossed into Kansas to intimidate free state settlers. Anti-slavery forces fought back. Towns were burned. People were murdered. The territory earned a grim nickname, Bleeding Kansas. In one notorious incident in 1856, abolitionist John Brown and his sons hacked 5 pro-slavery settlers to death with broadswords at Pottawatomie Creek. The violence even reached the Senate floor when South Carolina Congressman Preston Brooks beat Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner nearly to death with a cane after Sumner gave an anti-slavery speech. America was coming apart, and so were its political parties. The Whig Party collapsed first. It had always been a fragile coalition, and slavery shattered it. Northern Whigs couldn't stomach their Southern colleagues' defense of slavery. Southern Whigs couldn't abide the growing anti-slavery sentiment in the North. By 1856, the Whig Party was essentially dead, its last presidential candidate having lost badly in 1852. But nature abhors a vacuum, and so does politics. From the ruins of the Whig Party, from disaffected Northern Democrats, from free soilers and abolitionists, a new party emerged. They met in Ripon, Wisconsin, in 1854, and they took a name that hadn't been used in American politics for decades: Republican. They chose it deliberately, reaching back to Jefferson's Democratic-Republicans, claiming the legacy of the founding generation. But these Republicans were very different from Jefferson's party. The new Republican Party had one central, animating principle: stopping the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. They weren't all abolitionists. Many Republicans were willing to tolerate slavery where it already existed in the South. But they were united in their determination that slavery would not spread westward. They believed in free soil, free labor, free men. The idea that Western territory should be reserved for free white settlers who work their own land, not for plantation owners with slaves. The Republican Party grew with astonishing speed. In 1856, their first presidential candidate, John C. Fremont, carried 11 states despite being a new party. They drew support from former Whigs, anti-slavery Democrats, immigrants who opposed slavery's expansion, and evangelical Protestants who saw slavery as a moral sin. Geographically, they were a purely Northern party. They won not a single electoral vote in the South. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party was transforming too, but in the opposite direction. As Northern Democrats who opposed slavery left to join the Republicans, the party became increasingly dominated by Southern slaveholders and their Northern allies, whom Republicans derisively called dough faces, Northerners with Southern principles. The Democrats still won the presidency in 1856 with James Buchanan, but the fractures were showing. Then came 1860, and everything fell apart. The Democrats couldn't even agree on a candidate. When they met for their convention in Charleston, South Carolina, Southern delegates demanded that the party platform explicitly protect slavery in the territories. Northern Democrats, led by Stephen Douglas, refused. The Southerners walked out. The convention dissolved in chaos. Eventually, the Democrats split into 2 parties. Northern Democrats nominated Douglas, while Southern Democrats nominated John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, the sitting vice president, on a platform demanding federal protection for slavery in the territories. The Republicans, meanwhile, gathered in Chicago and made a fateful choice. They passed over the favorites, the fiery abolitionist William Seward and the veteran politician Salmon Chase, and instead nominated a former one-term congressman from Illinois, a self-educated lawyer who had gained fame debating Stephen Douglas just 2 years earlier. His name was Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was shrewd. He opposed slavery's expansion, but promised not to interfere with it where it already existed. He spoke in moral terms about slavery being wrong, But he also appealed to white workers' economic interests, arguing that slave labor degraded free labor. He supported tariffs to protect northern industry, a transcontinental railroad, and free land for Western settlers through what would become the Homestead Act. The Republican platform was designed to unite the North, factory workers and farmers, former Whigs and former Democrats, moderates and radicals. The election of 1860 was really two separate contests. In the North, Lincoln versus Douglas. In the South, Breckinridge versus a fourth candidate, John Bell of the Constitutional Union Party, who desperately tried to avoid the slavery issue altogether. Lincoln won decisively, carrying every free state except New Jersey. But here's the remarkable thing. Lincoln won the presidency with just under 40% of the popular vote and not a single electoral vote from the South. In 10 southern states, he wasn't even on the ballot. The South had threatened for years that if a black Republican won the presidency, they would secede. Now they made good on that threat. South Carolina seceded in December 1860, before Lincoln even took office. By February 1861, 7 southern states had left the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. When Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4, 1861, he spoke of union and conciliation, but his words fell on deaf ears. 5 weeks later, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The Civil War had begun. The Democratic and Republican parties had been forged in the fire of the slavery debate, and now they would be tested in the fire of war. The Democrats split between war Democrats who supported the Union and peace Democrats, called Copperheads by their enemies, who wanted to negotiate with the Confederacy. The Republicans united around Lincoln and the war effort, and as the war progressed, they would become increasingly radical in their goals, moving from simply preserving the Union to ending slavery itself. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, declaring slaves in rebel territories to be free, he fundamentally transformed the Republican Party's mission. This was no longer just about stopping slavery's expansion. This was about ending slavery, period. And when the 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865, finally and forever abolishing slavery throughout the United States, it was the Republican Party that had made it happen. But Lincoln would not live to see the fruits of victory. On April 14th, 1865, just days after the war's end, John Wilkes Booth assassinated him at Ford Theater. The fallen president became a martyr, and the Republican Party wrapped itself in his legacy. For generations, Republicans would call themselves the Party of Lincoln, the party that had saved the Union and freed the slaves. The Democrats, meanwhile, faced a reckoning. They had been the party of the South, the party associated with slavery and secession. How would they rebuild? How would they compete in a nation where 4 million formerly enslaved people were now free, where the South lay in ruins, where everything had changed? The answers to those questions would shape the next era of American politics, an era of reconstruction, of bitter struggle over the meaning of freedom and citizenship, of violence and backlash and betrayal. The war was over, but the battle for America's soul was just beginning. The war was over, but peace proved almost as difficult as the fighting had been. 4 million people who had been enslaved were now free. But what would freedom actually mean? Would former slaves become citizens? Would they vote? Would they own land? And what would happen to the defeated South? These weren't just policy questions. They would determine whether the Civil War had truly changed America, or whether the old order would simply resurrect itself in a new form. Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor, was a Democrat from Tennessee who had remained loyal to the Union. Lincoln had chosen him as vice president in 1864 to show that the Union was bipartisan. But Johnson was no Lincoln. He was a white supremacist who believed in states' rights and had little sympathy for the freed slaves. Johnson's plan for Reconstruction was lenient to the point of surrender. Pardon most former Confederates, let Southern states reorganize their governments quickly, and leave the question of black rights largely to the Southern states themselves. The results were predictable and horrifying. Southern states, led by the same men who had led the Confederacy, passed what became known as the Black Codes, laws designed to keep freed black people in a condition as close to slavery as possible. In Mississippi, black people couldn't own or lease farmland. In South Carolina, they had to have a special license to work in any job except farmer or servant. Across the South, any black person without a job could be arrested for vagrancy and forced to work for whoever paid their fine, which was usually their former owner. It was slavery by another name. But Johnson had underestimated the Republicans who controlled Congress. These radical Republicans, led by fierce abolitionists like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, were determined that the war's sacrifices would not be in vain. In 1866, they passed the Civil Rights Act, declaring that all persons born in the United States were citizens with equal rights under the law, regardless of race. When Johnson vetoed it, Congress overrode his veto, the first time in American history that Congress had overridden a presidential veto on a major piece of legislation. Then came something even more revolutionary. In 1868, the 14th Amendment was ratified, fundamentally rewriting the Constitution. It declared that anyone born in the United States was a citizen, and it promised all citizens equal protection of the laws. It was designed to prevent states from discriminating against black citizens, and it would become, over the next century and a half, perhaps the most important amendment in the Constitution. The foundation for civil rights, for Brown versus Board of Education, for the right to marry whom you choose, for countless battles over equality and justice. The Republicans weren't done. In 1870, the 15th Amendment was ratified, declaring that the right to vote could not be denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Black men, though not yet women of any race, were guaranteed the right to vote. These were extraordinary achievements, enforced by federal troops occupying the South. And for a brief, shining moment, they worked. Black men voted in huge numbers. They were elected to office, to state legislatures, to Congress, even to the Senate. Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce, both Republicans from Mississippi, became the first black senators in American history. South Carolina's legislature had a black majority. Black and white Republicans worked together, building public schools, rebuilding infrastructure, and creating a genuinely multiracial democracy. But this Reconstruction democracy was under constant, violent assault. The Ku Klux Klan, founded in 1865 by former Confederate soldiers, became a terrorist organization dedicated to restoring white supremacy. They burned black churches and schools. They murdered black political leaders and white Republicans who supported them. They whipped, tortured, and lynched black people who dared to vote or to assert their rights. In some counties, the violence was so systematic and overwhelming that Reconstruction governments collapsed entirely. The federal government tried to fight back. In 1871, Congress passed the Ku Klux Klan Act, which allowed the president to use military force and suspend habeas corpus to suppress the Klan's violence. President Ulysses S. Grant, the former Union general elected as a Republican in 1868, deployed troops and actually succeeded in breaking the Klan's power in some areas. But the violence continued under other names, other organizations. The White League in Louisiana, the Red Shirts in South Carolina. Wave after wave of terror aimed at destroying black political power. and Northerners were growing tired. The war had ended a decade earlier. Northern voters wanted to move on, to focus on economic growth and westward expansion rather than on policing the South. Northern Republicans began to prioritize business interests, railroad construction, tariff protection for industry, sound money policies, over civil rights. The party that had freed the slaves was slowly abandoning them. The end came in 1876, in another disputed presidential election. The Republican candidate was Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio. The Democrat was Samuel Tilden of New York. When the votes were counted, Tilden had won the popular vote and was one electoral vote short of the presidency. But 20 electoral votes from 4 states, Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Oregon, were disputed, with both parties claiming victory. Congress created a special commission to resolve the dispute, and in backroom negotiations, a deal was struck. It became known as the Compromise of 1877, though betrayal might be a better word. Hayes would become president. In exchange, he would withdraw the last federal troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. Southern Democrats also extracted promises of federal funding for Southern railroads and internal improvements. It was politics and economics trumping principle. When the troops left, Reconstruction democracy collapsed almost immediately. Southern Democrats, calling themselves Redeemers, took control of state governments across the South. They systematically dismantled black political power through violence, fraud, and eventually through law. By the 1890s, Southern states were passing Jim Crow laws that created a comprehensive system of racial segregation and disenfranchisement. They used poll taxes, fees that had to be paid to vote, which poor black people couldn't afford. They used literacy tests, administered by white registrars who would pass illiterate white men while failing literate black men with PhDs. They used grandfather clauses, saying you could only vote if your grandfather had voted, which of course, grandsons of slaves could not. In Louisiana, there were 130,000 registered black voters in 1896. By 1904, there were just 1,342. Similar numbers played out across the South, and the Supreme Court blessed it all. In 1896, in Plessy versus Ferguson, the court ruled that separate but equal facilities for black and white people were constitutional. This was the legal foundation for Jim Crow, and it would stand for nearly 60 years. By 1900, a new party system had solidified, and it looked very different from what had existed before the Civil War. The Republican Party had become the party of Northern business interests, of industry and finance, of high tariffs to protect American manufacturers. They still claimed the legacy of Lincoln, and black voters who could vote remained fiercely loyal to the Republicans, the party that had freed them, even if it had abandoned them. But civil rights was no longer the party's priority. The Democratic Party had become the party of the solid South. Every Southern state voted Democratic in presidential elections, often by margins of 80, 90, even 95%. Southern Democrats enforced white supremacy and segregation as party dogma. They controlled every level of government in the South: governors, legislatures, sheriffs, judges. They used that power to build a system of racial oppression that was, in some ways, more comprehensive than slavery had been, because it was backed by the force of law and the approval of the Supreme Court. But the Democrats weren't just a Southern party. They also drew support from urban political machines in the North, from Tammany Hall in New York to political bosses in Chicago and Boston. These machines provided services to immigrants, jobs, housing assistance, help with naturalization, in exchange for votes. Many Northern Democrats opposed the excesses of industrial capitalism and championed the interests of workers against powerful corporations. So the Democratic Party contained two very different wings: Southern white supremacists and Northern urban populists. They agreed on little except opposition to the Republicans. It was an unstable coalition, but it would hold for decades. The Republicans, meanwhile, presided over the Gilded Age, an era of spectacular economic growth and equally spectacular inequality. Industrialists like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan built vast empires in oil, steel, and finance. Cities exploded in size as immigrants poured in from Europe and rural Americans moved to factory jobs. Railroads spanned the continent. America was becoming an industrial powerhouse, but it was also an age of exploitation. Workers, including children, toiled in dangerous conditions for poverty wages. Strikes were met with private security forces and federal troops. The gap between rich and poor yawned wider than ever before. And the Republican Party, which had once stood for human freedom and equality, now seemed to stand primarily for the interests of wealthy industrialists. The stage was set for a new kind of politics, a politics of reform and populist uprising, of progressivism and labor organizing, of women demanding the vote and farmers demanding economic justice. Both parties would be challenged by these new movements, and both would change in response. But the basic alignment that emerged from Reconstruction, Republicans as the party of business in the North, Democrats as the party of the South and urban machines, would shape American politics for the next 70 years. The parties had not yet switched their positions on civil rights and the role of government. That transformation was still decades away, but the seeds had been planted. The betrayal of Reconstruction, the entrenchment of Jim Crow, the rise of industrial capitalism, and the growing demands for reform would all play their part in the dramatic realignment still to come. As the new century dawned, America was a nation of contradictions. It was the richest country on earth, yet millions lived in desperate poverty. It had fought a war to end slavery, yet racial oppression was now enshrined in law. It was a democracy, yet corporate monopolies seemed to wield more power than ordinary citizens. Something had to change, and a new generation of reformers was determined to make it happen. They called themselves progressives, and they came from both parties, and sometimes from neither. They were muckraking journalists, exposing corruption in newspapers and magazines. They were middle-class women organizing for social reform and demanding the right to vote. They were farmers in the West and South forming cooperatives to fight railroad monopolies. They were urban workers joining labor unions and demanding safe working conditions and fair wages. They were temperance crusaders convinced that alcohol was destroying families and communities. The progressive movement was a kaleidoscope of reform impulses, sometimes contradictory, but united by a belief that government could and should address the problems of industrial society. And this movement would transform both political parties, starting from an unexpected place within the Republican Party itself. Theodore Roosevelt became president by accident in 1901 when an anarchist assassinated President William McKinley. At 42, Roosevelt was the youngest president in American history. Energetic, charismatic, and utterly convinced that the presidency should be a bully pulpit for moral leadership. And he was something Republicans hadn't seen in decades, a reformer. Roosevelt looked at the massive corporations dominating American life, the trust that controlled oil, steel, railroads, and countless other industries, and he saw a threat to democracy itself. These corporations were so powerful they could dictate terms to farmers, workers, and small businesses. They could buy politicians and judges. They operated above the law. Roosevelt believed in capitalism, but he also believed it needed to be regulated for the public good. In 1902, Roosevelt ordered his Attorney General to file suit against the Northern Securities Company, a massive railroad trust controlled by J.P. Morgan and other titans of finance, under the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. Wall Street was shocked. Republicans weren't supposed to attack business, but Roosevelt wasn't intimidated. When Morgan came to Washington to negotiate, reportedly saying, "If we have done anything wrong, send your man to my man and they can fix it up," Roosevelt refused. This wasn't a private dispute between gentlemen. This was the government enforcing the law against monopolies. The case went to the Supreme Court, and in 1904, the government won. The Northern Securities Company was broken up, and Roosevelt had established that even the mightiest corporations were subject to federal authority. Roosevelt went on to prosecute over 40 other antitrust cases. He pushed for regulations on food and drugs after Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, exposed horrifying conditions in meatpacking plants. In 1906, Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, the beginning of federal consumer protection. Roosevelt also championed conservation, setting aside millions of acres as national forests and parks, believing that natural resources belong to all Americans, not just the timber and mining companies. He was remaking what it meant to be a Republican. But Roosevelt's reforms had limits. He did little to challenge Jim Crow or help Black Americans. When he invited Booker T. Washington to dinner at the White House in 1901, Southern Democrats erupted in rage, and Roosevelt never pushed further on racial issues. His progressivism was largely for white Americans. When Roosevelt chose not to run for another term in 1908, honoring the two-term tradition, he backed his friend William Howard Taft, who won easily. But Taft, though a genuine reformer himself, lacked Roosevelt's flair and political instincts. More importantly, he was caught between the progressive and conservative wings of the Republican Party, and he ended up alienating the progressives, including Roosevelt himself. By 1912, Roosevelt was furious with Taft and convinced that only he could continue the progressive agenda. He challenged Taft for the Republican nomination, and when the party establishment backed Taft at the convention, Roosevelt did something unprecedented. He bolted from the Republican Party and formed a third party. He called it the Progressive Party, though history remembers it as the Bull Moose Party, after Roosevelt declared he felt as strong as a bull moose. Roosevelt's 1912 campaign platform was radical for its time. He called for women's suffrage, for the direct election of senators instead of selection by state legislatures, for primary elections to choose party nominees instead of backroom deals at conventions, for a minimum wage, for an 8-hour workday, for workers' compensation, and for strict regulation of corporations. Some call him a socialist. Others said he was saving capitalism from itself. But Roosevelt's candidacy split the Republican vote, and the election went to the Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, the former president of Princeton University and governor of New Jersey. Wilson was himself a progressive, though a very different kind from Roosevelt. Where Roosevelt celebrated the power of the federal government, Wilson spoke of freeing individuals from both government and corporate control. Where Roosevelt was an energetic nationalist, Wilson was more cautious and idealistic. Wilson's first term saw an explosion of progressive legislation. In 1913, the 16th Amendment was ratified, giving Congress the power to levy an income tax, a way to fund the government that would fall more heavily on the wealthy than tariffs did on consumers. That same year, the 17th Amendment was ratified, establishing the direct election of senators, taking that power away from state legislatures and giving it to the people. Wilson also pushed through the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, creating a central banking system to manage the money supply and provide stability to the financial system. It was ironic, in a way. Democrats, the heirs of Andrew Jackson who had destroyed the second bank of the United States, were now creating another central bank. But the progressive era was scrambling old party positions. In 1914, Wilson signed the Clayton Antitrust Act, which strengthened antitrust law and explicitly exempted labor unions for being prosecuted as monopolies, a huge victory for organized labor. The Federal Trade Commission was created that same year to investigate and prevent unfair business practices. But Wilson, like Roosevelt, had a profound blind spot on race. He was a Southerner, born in Virginia, and he shared the racial prejudices of his region. His administration segregated federal government offices that had been integrated since Reconstruction. Black civil servants who had worked alongside white colleagues for decades were suddenly forced into separate workspaces or fired altogether. When a delegation of black leaders came to protest, Wilson dismissed them condescendingly. The progressive era's reforms were, in large measure, for white Americans only. The progressive movement also had a darker side that we must confront. Many progressives were eugenicists who believed in improving the human race through selective breeding. They supported forced sterilization of people they deemed unfit, the poor, the disabled, immigrants from undesirable countries. In 1927, the Supreme Court would uphold forced sterilization in Buck versus Bell, with Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., one of the era's most respected jurists, writing that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Tens of thousands of Americans would be forcibly sterilized under state eugenics laws, a shameful chapter that reminds us that reform movements can harbor terrible ideas alongside their genuine achievements. The progressive era also saw the culmination of decades of activism by the women's suffrage movement. For over 70 years, women had organized, marched, petitioned, and fought for the right to vote. They had been mocked, arrested, and force-fed when they went on hunger strikes in prison. But they persisted. The movement cut across party lines. There were Republican suffragists and Democratic suffragists, though Republicans were generally more supportive in the North. In 1919, Congress finally passed the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote. When Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify it in August 1920, the amendment became law. 26 million American women gained the right to vote. It was a transformation of democracy, and no one knew quite what it would mean for either party. The progressive era had reshaped American politics in both parties. The federal government was now expected to regulate business, protect consumers, conserve natural resources, and address social problems. Both Republicans and Democrats had progressive wings, though they disagreed on details and emphasis. The Republican progressives tended to favor strong federal action and national efficiency. The Democratic progressives tended to emphasize local control and suspicion of concentrated power, though Wilson's actions often contradicted this rhetoric. But World War I would interrupt this domestic reform agenda and change everything once again. Wilson, who had campaigned for re-election in 1916 with the slogan, "He kept us out of war," would lead America into the European conflict in 1917. The war would accelerate some progressive reforms. Women's suffrage was partly a reward for women's war work, but it would also unleash a wave of repression, nativism, and fear of radicalism that would poison American politics. When the war ended, Wilson tried to build a new world order through the League of Nations, an international organization designed to prevent future wars. But the Republican-controlled Senate, led by Henry Cabot Lodge, rejected American membership in the League. Wilson's health collapsed as he toured the country trying to build support, and he spent the last year and a half of his presidency incapacitated by a stroke, with his wife Edith effectively running the government in his name. The election of 1920 brought a Republican landslide. Warren G. Harding campaigned on a promise of normalcy, a return to the calmer, simpler America before the war and all its upheavals. Americans, exhausted by war, pandemic, the 1918 flu had killed hundreds of thousands, and social turmoil, voted overwhelmingly for Harding and the Republicans. The progressive era was over, at least for now. The 1920s would see a Republican ascendancy focused on business, prosperity, and a return to limited government, or so it seemed. The reforms of the progressive era remained on the books, and the precedent had been set. The federal government could and would intervene in the economy and society. That precedent would prove crucial in the next great crisis, just around the corner. A crisis that would fundamentally realign both parties and create the political system we still recognize today. The 1920s roared with prosperity, at least for those fortunate enough to share in it. The Republican Party dominated the decade, winning 3 consecutive presidential elections with margins that weren't even close. Warren G. Harding promised normalcy. Calvin Coolidge declared that the business of America is business. Herbert Hoover spoke of a future where poverty would be eliminated. The stock market soared. Factories hummed. Jazz played in speakeasies. Even though prohibition, the constitutional ban on alcohol, was the law of the land. Republicans took credit for the prosperity and championed a philosophy of limited government intervention in the economy. They believed that if business was left alone to operate freely, prosperity would naturally follow. Andrew Mellon, who served as Treasury Secretary through all 3 Republican administrations, slashed taxes on the wealthy, arguing that this would spur investment and economic growth. It was an early version of what would later be called trickle-down economics, the idea that benefits for the wealthy would eventually benefit everyone. But the prosperity was built on shaky ground. Farmers never recovered from the end of World War I and the collapse of agricultural prices. Workers' wages didn't keep pace with productivity gains. The wealth was concentrating at the top. And increasingly, the stock market was fueled by speculation and borrowed money. People were buying stocks on margin, putting down just a fraction of the cost and borrowing the rest, betting that prices would keep rising forever. They didn't. On October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday, the stock market crashed. Panic selling wiped out billions of dollars in wealth in a single day. But this wasn't just a stock market crisis. The crash exposed the fundamental weaknesses in the economy, and what followed was the worst economic catastrophe in American history, the Great Depression. Banks failed by the thousands. People lost their life savings overnight. Businesses collapsed. Unemployment soared. By 1933, 1 in 4 American workers couldn't find a job. Factories that had run 3 shifts stood idle and silent. Bread lines stretched around city blocks. Shanty towns of homeless people, mockingly called Hoovervilles, sprang up in every major city. Farmers lost their land to foreclosure and became migrants, wandering in search of work. The prosperity of the 1920s seemed like a fever dream. President Herbert Hoover, who had taken office just months before the crash, tried to respond. But Hoover was trapped by his own philosophy and his party's ideology. He believed deeply in rugged individualism, the idea that people should pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, that government handouts would undermine character and self-reliance. He encouraged voluntary cooperation between business and labor. He believed the economy would naturally correct itself if given time. He did create some federal programs, like the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, to lend money to struggling banks and businesses, but he resisted direct federal relief to unemployed workers and struggling families. As the Depression deepened, Hoover's approach seemed increasingly inadequate, even cruel. When desperate World War I veterans marched on Washington in 1932, demanding early payment of a promised bonus, Hoover ordered the Army to drive them out. General Douglas MacArthur, with Major Dwight Eisenhower as his aide, led troops with tanks and tear gas against American veterans and their families. The image of the government attacking its own veterans became a symbol of Hoover's failure. The election of 1932 was a Democratic landslide. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the governor of New York and a distant cousin of Theodore Roosevelt, promised a New Deal for the American people. He didn't lay out detailed plans. In fact, during the campaign, he sometimes contradicted himself, at one point promising to balance the budget and cut government spending. But he promised action, experimentation, bold leadership. And after 3 years of Hoover's inaction, Americans were desperate for someone willing to try something, anything. Roosevelt's victory was overwhelming. He won 42 of 48 states, carrying the entire South, most of the West, and even cracking the Republican strongholds in the Northeast and Midwest. The Democrats also won huge majorities in both houses of Congress. The Republican Party's reputation lay in ruins, blamed for the Depression and for doing too little to address it. When Roosevelt took office on March 4th, 1933, the banking system was on the verge of complete collapse. People were hoarding cash, withdrawing their savings in panic. In his inaugural address, Roosevelt spoke the words that would define his presidency. "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Then he acted. Roosevelt's first 100 days in office were a whirlwind of legislation unlike anything America had ever seen. He declared a bank holiday, temporarily closing all banks to stop the panic. He pushed through the Emergency Banking Act to stabilize the financial system. He created the Civilian Conservation Corps, which would eventually employ 3 million young men to plant trees, build parks, and work on conservation projects. He established the Federal Emergency Relief Administration to provide direct aid to the unemployed. He pushed through the Agricultural Adjustment Act to help farmers by reducing crop production and raising prices. He created the Tennessee Valley Authority, a massive public works project to bring electricity and economic development to one of the poorest regions of the country. And this was just the beginning. Over the next several years, Roosevelt and Congress built what became known as the New Deal, a fundamental transformation of the relationship between the federal government and American citizens. The Social Security Act of 1935 created the nation's first federal safety net for the elderly and unemployed. It wasn't charity. Workers paid into the system through payroll taxes, and they received benefits as a right. It was a revolutionary concept in American politics, the idea that the federal government had an obligation to protect citizens from the economic risks of old age and unemployment. The National Labor Relations Act, also passed in 1935, fundamentally shifted the balance of power between workers and employers. It guaranteed workers the right to organize unions and to bargain collectively with their employers. It created the National Labor Relations Board to enforce these rights. Union membership exploded. The Congress of Industrial Organizations formed in 1935, organizing mass production workers in industries like steel, auto manufacturing, and rubber. Labor unions became a major force in American politics and the backbone of the Democratic coalition. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 established a federal minimum wage and a maximum work week of 44 hours, later reduced to 40, with overtime pay for additional hours. It banned child labor in most industries. These protections, which we now take for granted, were bitterly opposed by business interests and by Republicans as socialism and the destruction of free enterprise. Roosevelt wasn't a socialist. He was trying to save capitalism by reforming it, by giving workers enough security and purchasing power to keep the economy functioning. But he was willing to go further than any previous president in using federal power to reshape the economy and society. And he built a political coalition to support it. The New Deal coalition became the foundation of Democratic power for the next half-century. It included Southern whites who had been voting Democratic since Reconstruction. It included Northern urban working-class voters, many of them recent immigrants or children of immigrants, Irish, Italian, Polish, Jewish, who saw the Democratic Party as defending them against exploitation. It included labor unions, which became perhaps the party's most important organizational force. And crucially, it included Black Americans who had been staunchly Republican since Lincoln's time. The shift of Black voters to the Democratic Party was gradual and complicated. Roosevelt himself did little directly for civil rights. He needed Southern Democratic senators to pass his legislation, and he wouldn't challenge Jim Crow. But his administration included advisors like Eleanor Roosevelt and Interior Secretary Harold Ikes, who genuinely cared about racial justice. New Deal programs, while often administered in discriminatory ways, did provide jobs and relief to many Black Americans. And symbolically, Roosevelt's willingness to include Black leaders in his Black cabinet of informal advisors and Eleanor Roosevelt's friendships with Black civil rights leaders sent a message. In 1936, for the first time, a majority of Black voters supported the Democratic presidential candidate. It was a seismic shift. The party of Lincoln was losing the voters who had been most loyal to Lincoln's legacy. By 1940, Black voters were solidly Democratic in the North, even as the Democratic Party remained the party of white supremacy in the South. This contradiction would eventually tear the party apart, but for now, it held. Roosevelt's popularity was so overwhelming that he broke George Washington's precedent and ran for a third term in 1940, and then a fourth term in 1944. He won all 4 elections, the only president ever to serve more than 2 terms. The Republican Party seemed permanently relegated to minority status. But the New Deal hadn't ended the Depression. Unemployment remained high throughout the 1930s, dropping from its peak of 25%, but never falling below about 14% until World War II. What finally ended the Depression was the massive government spending for the war effort, the ultimate Keynesian stimulus, though no one called it that at the time. The war years changed America in ways that would reshape both parties. 16 million Americans served in the military, including more than 1 million Black Americans who served in segregated units, but returned home determined to fight for equality. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking jobs in factories and offices that had been closed to them. The federal government's power expanded exponentially to mobilize the economy for total war. When Roosevelt died suddenly in April 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender, he left behind a transformed nation and transformed parties. The Democratic Party was now the party of active government, of federal programs to provide economic security, of support for labor unions, of ethnic and working-class urban voters. The Republicans remained the party of business and limited government, but they faced a fundamental question. Would they try to roll back the New Deal, or would they accept it and compete with Democrats on different grounds? That question would define Republican politics for the next generation. And another question loomed even larger. What would become of civil rights? The Democratic coalition included both Black voters in the North and white supremacists in the South. The Republican Party had abandoned its civil rights legacy, but was beginning to attract white Southerners uncomfortable with the Democratic Party's Northern liberals. These contradictions couldn't hold forever. The New Deal had established a new political order, but the order was unstable. The Great Realignment was still unfolding, and its next phase would revolve around the issue that had shaped American politics since the founding: race. The America that emerged from World War II was confident, prosperous, and deeply contradictory. It had defeated fascism abroad in the name of freedom and democracy. Yet at home, millions of Black Americans lived under a system of legal segregation that denied them basic rights. They couldn't vote in much of the South. They couldn't eat at the same lunch counters as white people. They couldn't attend the same schools. They faced violence and terror for asserting their dignity as human beings. This contradiction was becoming impossible to ignore, and it would force both political parties to make choices that would fundamentally transform them. Harry Truman, the plain-spoken Democrat from Missouri who succeeded Roosevelt, took the first steps. In 1948, Truman did something no president had done since Reconstruction. He made civil rights a central part of his political agenda. He issued executive orders desegregating the armed forces and banning discrimination in federal employment. He sent a sweeping civil rights program to Congress, calling for federal anti-lynching laws, the abolition of poll taxes, and the creation of a permanent Fair Employment Practices Commission. Southern Democrats were outraged. At the Democratic National Convention in 1948, the party adopted a civil rights plank in its platform, pushed through by young liberals like Minneapolis Mayor Hubert Humphrey, who declared, "The time has arrived for the Democratic Party to get out of the shadow of states' rights and walk forthrightly into the bright sunshine of human rights." Southern delegates walked out. They formed their own party, the States' Rights Democratic Party, or Dixiecrats, and nominated Strom Thurmond, the governor of South Carolina, for president. Thurmond carried 4 deep South states, winning 39 electoral votes. It was the first major crack in the solid South, the first sign that the Democratic coalition that Roosevelt had built couldn't hold together forever. Truman won anyway, in one of the greatest upsets in American political history, but the battle lines were drawn. The Democratic Party was becoming increasingly identified with civil rights in the North, even as it remained the party of segregation in the South. The Republican Party in this era was split too, though differently. The moderate Northeastern Republicans, led by figures like Thomas Dewey and later Nelson Rockefeller, generally supported civil rights, at least in theory. They saw themselves as heirs to Lincoln's legacy. But the Republican Party was also becoming the party of suburban middle-class whites, many of whom had fled cities as Black populations grew, and of business interests that opposed labor unions and government regulations. Then came Brown versus Board of Education. In 1954, the Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice Earl Warren, a Republican appointed by President Eisenhower, unanimously ruled that school segregation was unconstitutional. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal, the court declared, overturning Plessy versus Ferguson and striking at the very heart of Jim Crow. The South erupted in what they called massive resistance. State legislatures passed laws to evade or defy the court's ruling. Citizens' councils formed to organize white opposition. In 1957, when 9 Black students tried to integrate Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, Governor Orville Faubus called out the National Guard to block them. President Eisenhower, a Republican who privately questioned the Brown decision, nonetheless felt compelled to enforce federal law. He federalized the Arkansas National Guard and sent the 101st Airborne Division to escort the students into school. The first time since Reconstruction that federal troops had been deployed in the South to protect Black citizens' rights. It was a dramatic moment, but Eisenhower did it reluctantly, motivated more by respect for the rule of law than by commitment to racial equality. The Republican Party of the 1950s was cautious on civil rights, not wanting to alienate either its moderate northern wing or the southern white voters it hoped to attract. The civil rights movement was about to force everyone's hand. On December 1st, 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, a seamstress named Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat to a white passenger. Her arrest sparked a bus boycott that lasted 381 days and introduced the nation to a young Baptist minister named Martin Luther King Jr. King's philosophy of nonviolent resistance, rooted in Christian faith and inspired by Gandhi, would define the movement. Through the late 1950s and early 1960s, the movement grew in power and moral clarity. Black college students staged sit-ins at segregated lunch counters, refusing to leave until they were served or arrested. Freedom riders, both black and white, rode interstate buses into the Deep South to challenge segregation in bus terminals, facing mob violence and imprisonment. Protesters marched and were met with fire hoses, police dogs, and clubs. The images were broadcast on television news into living rooms across America and around the world. The contrast was stark and undeniable. Peaceful protesters asking only for basic rights met with brutal violence. The violence wasn't hidden anymore. It was visible for everyone to see. In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested in Birmingham, Alabama, and wrote his famous letter from Birmingham jail, explaining why Black Americans could no longer wait for gradual change. That summer, 250,000 people marched on Washington, where King delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Just weeks later, a bomb exploded at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, killing 4 young black girls. The nation was reaching a crisis point. President John F. Kennedy, a Democrat, had been cautious on civil rights during his first 2 years in office. Like many Northern Democrats, he sympathized with the movement, but feared alienating Southern Democrats whose support he needed in Congress. But by 1963, the violence and the moral clarity of the movement had made inaction impossible. Kennedy proposed comprehensive civil rights legislation and called civil rights a moral issue, as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. When Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963, his successor, Lyndon Baines Johnson, took up the cause. Johnson was a Texan, a master of Senate politics, and a shrewd calculator of power. But he was also, surprisingly, deeply committed to civil rights. He told Congress and the nation that the best way to honor Kennedy was to pass his civil rights bill. And Johnson used every ounce of his political skill to make it happen. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was the most sweeping civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. It banned discrimination in public accommodations, restaurants, hotels, theaters. It banned employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It gave the federal government power to enforce school desegregation. It was a frontal assault on Jim Crow. The bill faced a filibuster from Southern Democrats in the Senate, led by Richard Russell of Georgia and Robert Byrd of West Virginia, who spoke for 75 days trying to kill it. But Johnson worked with Republican leaders to break the filibuster. The final vote saw 73% of Democrats supporting the bill, but crucially, 80% of Republicans also voted for it. Republican support was essential for passage. Without it, Southern Democrats could have blocked the bill indefinitely. The night Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, he reportedly told an aide, Bill Moyers, "I think we just delivered the South to the Republican Party for a long time to come." Johnson understood that by championing civil rights, the Democratic Party was breaking with its Southern base. And he was right. In the 1964 presidential election, Johnson faced Barry Goldwater, a conservative Republican senator from Arizona. Goldwater had voted against the Civil Rights Act, one of only 6 Republican senators to do so. He argued it violated states' rights and property rights, echoing the arguments that had been used to defend slavery and segregation for a century. Goldwater lost in a landslide, carrying only 6 states. But 5 of those 6 were in the Deep South, states that had been reliably Democratic since Reconstruction. Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Georgia all voted Republican for president for the first time since 1872. The realignment was beginning. Johnson didn't stop with the Civil Rights Act. In 1965, after state troopers in Selma, Alabama, brutally attacked peaceful marchers on what became known as Bloody Sunday, Johnson addressed Congress and called for voting rights legislation. He invoked the Civil Rights Anthem, saying, "We shall overcome." The Voting Rights Act of 1965 banned literacy tests and other devices used to disenfranchise black voters. It authorized federal examiners to register voters in areas with a history of discrimination. It was the most effective voting rights legislation in American history, and within a few years, black voter registration in the South soared from about 30% to nearly 60%. But Johnson's Great Society, his vision of using federal power to eliminate poverty and inequality, was running into trouble. The Vietnam War was consuming resources and political capital. Urban riots erupted in cities across the North, starting with Watson, Los Angeles in 1965, and continuing through Detroit and Newark in 1967. White voters, even liberal ones, were growing anxious about social change happening too fast, and the Republican Party saw an opportunity. Richard Nixon, who had lost narrowly to Kennedy in 1960 and seemed finished politically after losing the California governor's race in 1962, engineered one of the great comebacks in American political history. Nixon understood that the Democratic coalition was fracturing. Working-class white ethnics in the North felt threatened by black demands for equality, by riots in cities, by what they saw as the excesses of the counterculture and the anti-war movement. Southern whites were enraged by civil rights legislation and felt betrayed by the Democratic Party. Nixon developed what his strategists called the Southern Strategy, a deliberate effort to appeal to white Southern voters and conservative Northern whites through coded racial messages. Nixon didn't use explicitly racist language. Instead, he talked about law and order, about the silent majority of hardworking Americans who were tired of protests and riots, about states' rights, and opposing forced busing to integrate schools. The strategy worked. In 1968, Nixon won the presidency, though he didn't win the popular vote majority. Third-party candidate George Wallace, the segregationist former governor of Alabama, won 5 southern states and siphoned off votes that might have gone to either major party candidate. But Nixon had shown that a Republican could compete in the South by appealing to white voters' racial anxieties. For years later, in 1972, Nixon won re-election in a landslide, carrying every state except Massachusetts. He won the entire South. The party of Lincoln was becoming the party of Southern white conservatives. The party of the Confederacy was becoming the party of civil rights and racial equality. The realignment wasn't complete yet. It would take another generation for the South to become solidly Republican at all levels of government. Many Southern Democrats remained in Congress and state legislatures, but the direction was clear. The parties were switching their positions on civil rights, on race, on the role of the federal government in addressing inequality. By the mid-1970s, the political landscape looked very different from what it had been just 20 years earlier. The Democratic Party was the party of civil rights, of federal social programs, of labor unions, of racial minorities, of liberal social values. The Republican Party was the party of limited government, of traditional values, of law and order, of white Southern conservatives and Northern suburbanites concerned about crime and social disorder. The Great Realignment was underway, driven by the issue that had divided American politics from the very beginning: the question of racial equality and what role the federal government should play in achieving it. The parties that had emerged from the Civil War had finally completed their long, slow transformation. They had, in effect, switched places. The 1970s marked the beginning of the political world we inhabit today. The Great Realignment that had begun with the Civil Rights Movement was accelerating, reshaping not just what the party stood for, but who voted for them and why. Richard Nixon's presidency ended in disgrace with the Watergate scandal. In 1974, facing certain impeachment for his role in covering up a break-in at Democratic National Committee headquarters and other abuses of power, Nixon became the first president to resign. His vice president, Gerald Ford, pardoned him, a decision that was politically toxic, but which Ford believed necessary to help the nation heal. The pardon likely cost Ford the 1976 election, which went to Jimmy Carter, a Democratic governor from Georgia who ran as an outsider and a man of unimpeachable character. Carter's victory seemed to suggest the South might remain competitive for Democrats if they nominated Southern moderates. Carter won every Southern state except Virginia, but his presidency struggled with economic stagflation, the combination of high inflation and high unemployment that defied conventional economic wisdom, and with foreign policy crises, particularly the Iranian hostage crisis that saw 52 Americans held captive for 444 days. And something else was happening that would transform the Republican Party and American politics: the rise of the religious right. For most of American history, evangelical Christians had largely stayed out of politics, viewing it as worldly and corrupt. But in the 1970s, a new generation of evangelical leaders decided they needed to engage politically to defend what they saw as traditional moral values under assault. The Supreme Court's Roe v. Wade decision in 1973, which established a constitutional right to abortion, galvanized many conservative Christians. So did issues like the proposed Equal Rights Amendment for women, the rise of feminism and gay rights activism, and court decisions limiting school prayer. In 1979, Jerry Falwell founded the Moral Majority, an organization dedicated to mobilizing evangelical Christians for conservative political causes. Falwell and others like Pat Robertson built a powerful grassroots movement that would become a core constituency of the Republican Party. They didn't just care about abortion and school prayer. They connected these family values issues to a broader conservative agenda of limited government, strong national defense, and traditional social hierarchies. This movement found its champion in Ronald Reagan. Reagan, the former Hollywood actor and California governor, swept to victory in 1980, defeating Carter in an electoral landslide. Reagan carried 44 states, including every southern state except Carter's home state of Georgia. Reagan was a conservative revolutionary, but he wrapped his revolution in sunny optimism and patriotic rhetoric. He promised to restore American greatness, to rebuild the military, to cut taxes and regulations, and to shrink the federal government. His famous line was, "Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem." Reagan's economic philosophy, which came to be called Reaganomics or supply-side economics, held that cutting taxes, especially on the wealthy and on corporations, would stimulate investment and economic growth that would benefit everyone. In 1981, Reagan signed the Economic Recovery Tax Act, which cut the top individual income tax rate from 70% to 50% and later to 28%. He slashed regulations on business and finance. He confronted labor unions, most dramatically in 1981 when he fired more than 11,000 striking air traffic controllers, a decision that symbolized a new, more hostile relationship between Republicans and organized labor. Reagan's policies did help spark economic growth, though they also contributed to soaring budget deficits and growing income inequality. The gap between rich and poor, which had been narrowing since the New Deal, began widening again in the Reagan era, a trend that has continued ever since. But Reagan's most important legacy may be in completing the realignment of the South. Reagan spoke the language of states' rights and limited government. He kicked off his 1980 campaign with a speech in Philadelphia, Mississippi, the town where 3 civil rights workers had been murdered in 1964, declaring his support for states' rights, a phrase with deep racial resonance. Whether or not this was intentional racial signaling is still debated, but the effect was clear. White Southern conservatives heard a message they liked. The 1984 election confirmed the realignment. Reagan won 49 states in a landslide over Democrat Walter Mondale. Republicans were now dominant in the South at the presidential level, and increasingly competitive in congressional and state races. The Democratic Solid South had become the Republican Solid South. The Democratic Party, meanwhile, was struggling to find its identity. After the liberal George McGovern's crushing defeat in 1972 and Carter's one-term presidency, many Democrats felt the party had moved too far left and lost touch with middle-class voters. A group of centrist Democrats formed the Democratic Leadership Council in 1985, arguing that the party needed to moderate its positions, particularly on economic issues, to win back white working class and suburban voters. This moderate wing found its champion in Bill Clinton, governor of Arkansas, who won the presidency in 1992. Clinton called himself a New Democrat, pro-business, tough on crime, supportive of welfare reform. In 1996, he signed a welfare reform bill that imposed work requirements and time limits on benefits, declaring the era of big government is over. Clinton moved the Democratic Party toward the center on economic issues, embracing free trade and fiscal discipline, while maintaining the party's commitment to abortion rights, gun control, and environmental protection. Clinton's presidency saw economic prosperity, the longest peacetime economic expansion in American history, with budget surpluses and low unemployment. But his personal scandals, culminating in his impeachment by the Republican House in 1998 for lying under oath about an affair with White House intern Monica Lewinsky, energized the Republican base and contributed to growing partisan polarization. The 2000 election between Clinton's vice president, Al Gore, and Texas Governor George W. Bush, son of the former president, was one of the closest in history. Gore won the popular vote by about 500,000 votes, but the Electoral College came down to Florida, where Bush led by just 537 votes after a contentious recount. The Supreme Court's controversial decision in Bush versus Gore stopped the recount and effectively awarded the presidency to Bush. Many Democrats believe the election had been stolen, intensifying partisan bitterness. Bush's presidency was defined by the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, which killed nearly 3,000 Americans and launched the War on Terror. Bush invaded Afghanistan to overthrow the Taliban regime that had harbored al-Qaeda, then in 2003 invaded Iraq based on claims, later proved false, that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. The Iraq War became deeply unpopular, contributing to Democratic victories in the 2006 midterm elections and setting the stage for 2008. The 2008 election brought another historic transformation. Barack Obama, a first-term senator from Illinois and the son of a white mother from Kansas and a black father from Kenya, won the Democratic nomination over Hillary Clinton in a hard-fought primary, then defeated Republican John McCain to become the first black president in American history. Obama's victory seemed to herald a new political era, particularly as he assembled a coalition of young voters, minorities, and college-educated whites. Obama entered office during the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, the 2008 financial crisis that saw major banks collapse and unemployment surge. His response included a large stimulus package and a controversial bailout of the auto industry. But his signature achievement was the Affordable Care Act, passed in 2010, which extended health insurance to millions of Americans through a combination of subsidies, insurance market regulations, and an expansion of Medicaid. The Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, as it became known, provoked fierce opposition from Republicans and energized the Tea Party movement, a grassroots conservative movement that emerged in 2009 in opposition to government spending, the bailouts, and particularly to Obamacare. The Tea Party helped Republicans win a landslide victory in the 2010 midterm elections, gaining 63 House seats. Obama won re-election in 2012, but his second term was marked by legislative gridlock. Republicans, who controlled the House and later the Senate, opposed nearly everything he proposed. The partisan polarization that had been building for decades reached new heights. Members of Congress increasingly refused to work across party lines. Compromise became a dirty word. The parties sorted themselves ideologically. Nearly all conservatives became Republicans. Nearly all liberals became Democrats, and the moderate center shrank dramatically. This polarization wasn't just in Washington. It was reshaping American society. Republicans and Democrats increasingly lived in different places, watched different news channels, and believed fundamentally different things about reality. Studies showed that members of both parties increasingly view the other party not just as wrong, but as a threat to the nation. Then came 2016, and an election that shocked the political establishment. Donald Trump, a real estate developer and reality television star with no political experience, won the Republican nomination despite the opposition of most party leaders. Trump ran a campaign unlike any in modern American history, explicitly nationalist, hostile to immigration and free trade, dismissive of political correctness, and willing to attack fellow Republicans as readily as Democrats. He promised to make America great again, to build a wall on the Mexican border, to bring back manufacturing jobs, and to drain the swamp in Washington. Trump narrowly defeated Hillary Clinton, winning the Electoral College while losing the popular vote by nearly 3 million votes. His victory was powered by white working-class voters in Midwestern states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, states that have been reliably Democratic in recent elections. These voters, many of them former Democrats, felt left behind by globalization and cultural change, and they responded to Trump's populist message. Trump's presidency accelerated virtually every trend toward polarization. His norm-breaking behavior, his attacks on the media and democratic institutions, his harsh immigration policies, his response to racial justice protests, and his refusal to accept the results of the 2020 election culminated in the January 6, 2021, attack on the Capitol by his supporters attempting to prevent the certification of Joe Biden's electoral victory. Trump became only the third president to be impeached, and the only president to be impeached twice, though the Senate acquitted him both times. The Republican Party transformed under Trump. It became more populist, more nationalist, more skeptical of free trade and immigration, more willing to challenge democratic norms and institutions. Traditional Republican priorities like deficit reduction and entitlement reform faded. Instead, the party focused on cultural issues, opposition to woke ideology, critical race theory in schools, transgender rights, immigration, and defending what they called traditional American values. The Democratic Party moved left in response, particularly on cultural issues. The party became more explicitly progressive on racial justice, LGBTQ rights, climate change, and economic inequality. The growth of the party's progressive wing, energized by figures like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, pushed the party toward more ambitious government programs like Medicare for All and the Green New Deal, though moderates retained significant influence. Joe Biden, a moderate Democrat who had served as Obama's vice president, won the 2024 election by assembling a coalition of suburban voters, minorities, young people, and college-educated whites. But Biden governed during a period of intense polarization, managing the COVID-19 pandemic, economic challenges including high inflation, and ongoing cultural conflicts. By 2026, the two parties occupy very different worlds. The Democratic Party is the party of diversity, racial minorities, college-educated whites, urban and suburban voters, young people, and women, particularly unmarried women. It supports activist government to address climate change, inequality, and racial injustice. It champions abortion rights, gun control, LGBTQ equality, and environmental protection. The Republican Party is the party of white voters, particularly white voters without college degrees, rural and small-town America, evangelical Christians, and older voters. It opposes what it sees as excessive government regulation and taxation. It emphasizes border security and restrictive immigration policies, Second Amendment rights, opposition to abortion, and skepticism of climate change policies it views as economically harmful. The geographic sorting is stark. Democrats dominate cities and increasingly prosperous suburbs. Republicans dominate rural areas, small towns, and less educated, working-class communities. This geographic polarization reinforces political polarization. When people live among others who think like them, their views tend to become more extreme. And here we are today, the inheritors of this long, complex history. The parties that began as loose coalitions around disputes over banking and federal power have transformed through cycles of crisis and realignment. They switched positions on civil rights. They switched geographic bases. They switched class coalitions. The party of Lincoln now dominates the Confederacy. The party of the Confederacy now champions the federal government's power to address inequality. What both parties share is a sense that the stakes have never been higher, that the other party represents not just bad policies, but a fundamental threat to America itself. Whether this polarization can be bridged, whether these parties can find ways to govern together in a deeply divided nation, whether new parties or movements might emerge to challenge this binary choice. These are the questions that will shape American politics in the years ahead. The story of the Democratic and Republican parties is the story of America itself, of conflict and compromise, of principle and pragmatism, of high ideals and base calculations, of progress and backlash, of how we struggle to form a more perfect union while disagreeing fundamentally about what that union should be. It's a story that continues to unfold, written by each new generation of Americans who must decide what these parties will stand for and who they will serve. And that, in the end, is up to all of us. This concludes this journey through the history of the political parties in America. Thank you for listening, and be sure and subscribe and turn on notifications so you know when the next journey through history is ready to embark on. Thanks again, and have a good night.